Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. China and the West have a long history of a cultural exchange. However, as China's global power grows, Chinese people are becoming more confident. More Chinese are reading the Confucian classics, while others even call on people to reject the concept of Christmas from the West. What influence has Western culture had on modern China? How do Chinese people view the West nowadays? And what about the image of China in the West? To discuss all these issues and more, today I'm happy to be joined by Professor Daniel Bell from Tsinghua University and Professor June Chen, an intercultural filmmaker. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
The advent of the Lunar New Year evokes a renewed interest in the Monkey King, the hero in the Chinese classic Journey to the West. What does the West embody in traditional Chinese culture? In Tang Dynasty China, a 17-year westward odyssey finally took the monk Xuanzang to India in search of sacred texts of Buddhism. How important is his pilgrimage to the West to the development of Buddhism in China? What impact does Buddhism have on modern China? In 1840, the Opium War pushed China into its first conflict with the West, ushering in an era of the Chinese people fighting against the oppression of Western imperialism. More than 200 years have passed. Are the two civilizations still in conflict?
共同建设丝绸之路经济带，打造互利共赢的命运共同体。
Raising the One Belt, One Road initiative, China hopes it will improve cooperation among countries across Asia, Europe and Africa. Will the initiative bring China and the West closer together and build a more harmonious Eurasia?
Welcome to Dialogue. In the previous edition of Dialogue, we talked about the journey to the West and a comparison between three kinds of animals: giant panda, monkey king, and the dragon. Each represents different aspects of Chinese national character. Today, however, the key word is West, because we've been talking about different pilgrimage or journeys to, or long march to the West, in terms of what we can learn from the industrial and advanced countries like European countries and North America. So today, when we look at the word West, what immediately crosses your mind, Daniel?
Well, Western civilization, allegedly the most advanced civilization, and I think throughout the 20th century, China did look to the West in order to learn how to modernize. But I think what's changing now is that it's no longer just a teacher-student relationship. I think China doesn't want to be a student anymore. They also want to be a teacher, and vice versa. I think the West realizes there are many problems in their own systems, and they're also willing to learn from abroad.
Dr. Henry Kissinger used the phrase of a co-evolution to characterize the new relationship between the two countries across the Pacific Ocean. Let's come back to examine Journey to the West. Buddhism first reached China from India roughly 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty. The influence of Buddhism in China reached its peak during the Tang Dynasty. Some scholars say that to a great degree, the development of Chinese philosophy is based on the development of Buddhism. Do you agree? And what impact does Indian Buddhism have on Chinese culture nowadays?
Well, right before Buddhism, we have the indigenous religion, that is Confucianism, if we can call it a religion. We have Confucianism, we also have Taoism, and then we have Buddhism later. I think with Confucianism, which is considered to be the state religion, it has such an important role in the relationship of social harmony. The very essence of Confucianism is to create order, is the relationship between the individual with the rest member of the society. However, with Taoism, is about man's relationship with nature, and with Buddhism is about the mind, the evolution of the mind. The essence of Buddhism to me is about the consciousness. Well, with Buddhism, we have two wings. One is compassion, the other is wisdom. The way to consolidate the two is to cultivate your senses, cultivate your consciousness. And I heard there's a saying, they say with Confucianism is when you're at work, and with Taoism is at the weekend, and with Buddhism is when you're with death. But however, with Buddhism is about living too. Living is death, death is living. So this paradox, this duality of living and death, is something that we human need to understand. And when we say we human, all the sentient beings, including human and maybe animals and also plants, and everything that has senses is being taken into consideration. So it's about the universe. To me, it's a bigger cosmos that Buddhism is dealing with, much bigger than Confucianism. And Taoism is actually very deep for me to understand too. As you said, yin and yang, and also other 5 elements as is water, is wind, is metal, is earth, and is they're the ultimate elements that transform human being, that can prepare you into a cycle of life if you believe in the rebirth or reincarnation.
Yeah, reincarnation is of course one of the catchphrases for Tibetan Buddhism. Isn't it surprising, Daniel and John, that in China we've never had any serious religious warfare? In the West, however, between Islam and Christianity, you had a crusade. So back in the after September the 11th terrorist attacks, President Bush he had a slip of tongue describing the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq as a crusade. Now, crusade does have a very strong religious implications between these two civilizations, Christianity and Islamism. But in China, we didn't have that. Christianity, Islamism, Buddhism, you name it, all found their way into China peacefully, and different schools of thought coexisted peacefully. What do you make of this miracle? China is able to come to terms with the different ideologies, different religious beliefs.
Well, the monotheistic religions have this view there's one God, and typically you're either on our side or you're on the wrong side. Whereas I think this view that there's only one truth and there's only one path to truth is quite antithetical to the kind of mainstream way of thinking about what we can call religion in China. I mean, even if you visit temples, there's a Taoist element, there's a Buddhist element, there's folk religion, there's Confucian. They're all mixed up and not clear cut. I mean, it would be impossible to the West to imagine going to like a Catholic church, which has, you know, very strong Islamic characteristics and Jewish characteristics. There's very clear divisions between different religions, but in China, historically, it hasn't been so clear. And arguably, that makes the religious outlooks more tolerant.
Tolerance is a very interesting word. But Daniel, I'd like to have your interpretation about why President Xi Jinping called for ancient and classical poems to be incorporated into textbooks of primary education in China. In fact, our sense of history and our sense of history always comes along with a memory about misery and humiliation. Starting from the First Opium War in 1840, the door of China was forced open by gunboat policy in the 19th century. So, to some degree, some Chinese scholars argue, although in a controversial manner, that the 2 Opium Wars, the devastating defeat of the Qing Dynasty's navy through Jiawu Zhanzheng, as well as the 8-year anti-Japanese war, the 3-year civil strife, as well as the decade of upheavals that we engineered ourselves in Cultural Revolution, could all be called an Enlightenment movement, or different parts of the Enlightenment movement. Without these negative texts or contents of the textbooks, China would not have been so bold and determined to go ahead with the modernization program, because we know what it means to have a humiliation. We know what poverty actually means for diplomacy and the influence of this weak nation that ironically boasts of 5,000 years of history.
Right. So in the 20th century, the main tradition was anti-traditionalism, because Chinese intellectuals and reformers blamed China's own traditions for China's poverty and backwardness. And it was thought that we need to look to the West, just as Japan did, to rapidly modernize. But eventually, over the past 2 or 3 decades, I think it's became obvious that some of the Confucian values that have underpinned modernization in other East Asian countries with a Confucian heritage, like a kind of this worldly outlook, a long-term outlook, a strong emphasis on education and self-improvement, that these values also underpin modernization in China. So people have now a less negative attitude towards tradition. That's part of it. But on the other hand, modernization also leads people to become more individualistic and atomized, and there's a need to promote social responsibility. And here, the traditions, and especially Confucianism, which strongly emphasizes social relations and responsibility to society, have a clear role to play in promoting a greater sense of responsibility. So I think that's one important reason why Confucianism and other traditions are being promoted now in educational textbooks. But it's not just by the government, it's also at different levels of what we can call civil society.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with June Chen and Daniel Bell. We're discussing in this year of a monkey how to look at issues of democracy, freedom of speech, a comparison between East and West in terms of what China should learn through a journey to the West. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us.
Chinese New Year 2016, the year of the monkey.
Mike, I hear that monkeys are witty and mischievous. You wouldn't have happened to be born in the year of the monkey.
Well, actually not. But I'm wondering if perhaps some of our colleagues elsewhere might be.
Well, just a minute, Mike. The monkey is also smart and clever, and that makes me think of our colleagues in Beijing.
Well, yes, the monkey is clever, witty, mischievous, and smart. But there is so much more to it than that. The year of the monkey, in fact, the Chinese New Year.
It is a time to come together, to enjoy family and friendships.
And usher in a prosperous new year. So from all of us,
Happy New Year! Tuwatakia mwaka mpya mwema wenye fanaka.
Welcome back, Joan and Daniel. The moviegoers, very much like the new Hollywood blockbuster Kung Fu Panda the Third. I mean, Mulan, Kung Fu Panda are able to tell very good story about Chinese philosophy, the Taoism, the martial arts. In comparison with them, we feel quite ashamed that China to be able to tell a good story about this big country. Is it a matter of storytelling? It involves what I do, because I'm a journalist. Our discussion here is part of our enormous effort to convey a message that China is different from your perception, which is stereotyped and politically motivated and perhaps using ideological lens. What do you think?
Well, I think partly China is such a rich civilization, and most intellectuals, when they speak and think, they refer back to literally thousands of years of Chinese history in a way which isn't true of Westerners. So, for example, in Canada where I'm from, there's not that long a history, and when you make a movie, you draw on a pretty thin set of values that are shared by many other societies. But when Chinese might make a movie, it might refer to a very long civilization which may not be shared or known outside of China. Or sometimes you have these great local movies like Lao Pao, which is...
Mr. Six, that's a very good movie.
Right.
We discussed this movie.
I really disagree.
Okay.
Yeah, it's...
Well, my point is that movie is hard to be enjoyed by people outside of China, or maybe even outside of Beijing, even though it's a great movie. So, of course, that's part of it, but the other part of it, of course, is freedom of expression and innovation, which is key to developing stories that are widely appreciated abroad.
Of course, China doesn't have a perfect record about human rights and the spirit of innovation, but we are doing that. We encourage entrepreneurship and the spirit of innovation to further urbanize China. But the issue of universal values, I'd like to have your elaboration, a little bit more elaboration about your understanding of universal values. How universal are those values?
Well, most ethical traditions, including Confucianism, when the great thinkers put forward their views, they don't just put them forward for local context. You know, when Confucius or Mencius developed their views, they meant it was applicable for the whole world, for Tianxia. So in that sense, they're similar. The question is now maybe which values are really shared by many societies, and here there's a pretty thin list, like don't kill innocent people. Of course, even then we have some people like Islamic State that wouldn't be part of that universal consensus. You know, don't enslave people, don't carry out genocide. But beyond that, there's so much difference, and some of it is reasonable difference. For example, how do we select leaders? Is it one person, one vote, the only legitimate way? Or can we have other means, such as examinations and performance evaluations at lower levels of government? So there's a pretty thin kind of consensus. Even that, some terrorist groups are not part of that consensus. That I think is China and the West, meaning here Western countries, are totally on the same side, at least in principle. But beyond that, there's a great deal of reasonable room for difference.
Exactly. You know, if you look at Mr. Xi Jinping's initiative of a Belt and Road, its essence talks about being inclusive, being open, being transparent, very much like what we practice in establishing AIIB, right? It's a new form of global financial governance whose job is to help build infrastructure in developing countries, whilst the TPP might be exclusive a little bit without accepting China, at least at this moment. And previously for IMF and reform of which, China was rejected for having more voting powers. When we hold different rounds of strategic and economic dialogue with the United States, it's called the ISNED. China tends to say, let's look at the strategic issues, but the US says, let's look at specific issues, detail-oriented, cyber espionage, cyber security, IPR violations, trade protectionism, so on and so forth. But China says, we are big powers. We should have a new type of major power relationship. We should look at the broad issues. The US says, no, we should talk about either this is wrong or right. So what do you think of the different way of thinking?
I think culturally, China and the United States, and maybe the Western culture in particular, are fundamentally different in terms of transparency. China, I think, is deeply embedded in Confucianism, which emphasizes on rituals and etiquettes. With rituals and etiquettes, you're supposed to be very polite. You do not supposed to offend anyone. So in many business occasions, you don't want to say no when in fact you already decide not to do business with that person. So with China, maybe one way to say let's look at the bigger issue is to probably avoid to be specific on certain issue, not intentionally, but China is a big country. It's considered to be the center of the world. They want to see the big picture so that they can have a handle on the big picture. But I think with the United States, without the details, they don't know where the direction is. So I think there is such a distance or gap to be closed, and I wonder whether we can ever do that.
Perhaps you have blown it out of proportion a little bit when you say the perception gap is big. Let's look at what happened in the Middle East. The United States finds it very difficult and has been very reluctant to interfere with Saudi Arabia, despite some mild criticism about its human rights. And people say it's because of the close oil-dollar relationship. So don't you think that the U.S. has two different faces? On the one hand, it wants to preach like a Christian priest. On the other hand, it wants to make money. It's very practical and flexible. So it doesn't necessarily examine the world in black and white terms. Although time and again China is urged to attack strings and to interfere and to seek regime change. That's what they do. We don't do that.
Right. Well, so there are some basic, we can call them universal values that are shared by both the US and China, like a government shouldn't carry out genocide against its own people. And actually the early Confucians, including Mencius, were very explicit. He was writing in the Warring States period, that if another ruler severely presses the people, then actually then we have an obligation to rescue those people, so long as the people welcome us. So in this sense, there is some overlap that both sides would agree. If a country really carries out genocide against its people, then there's moral limits against what we can do. But beyond that, China, as you say, doesn't have this view that they have to have a very similar form of government selecting rulers by one person, one vote. Otherwise, they're not legitimate, and somehow we're not going to deal with them, at least in theory, even though in practice, as you say, it's very different.
I have one more thought on universal values, if I may express it with you. When we say universal values, we're talking about the universe, do we? And if we're talking about universe, we human beings inhabit in the universe, so maybe we should withdraw ourselves from the very tight web of human. Can we look at our relationship with the planet? I think it's very timely to address the issue of environmental health. So if we're thinking about universal value, I think this concern for environment is a huge value to be shared with. Would you agree with me? So in a new century, that's something we should think about?
1.5 centuries ago, before the Opium War forced open the door of China, Chinese authorities thought that we were the center of the universe. Therefore, China was called the Central Kingdom. So when you look at the issue of universal values, look, what we called for, what we practiced here in China should be applied universally. That's what the emperors from different dynasties said, perhaps. So, yes, indeed, while we emphasize on the importance of universality, we should also talk about cultural diversity. And across the broad spectrum of public opinions, you cannot just always have the two extremes, black and white. That's what China, how we look at the world. Now, the last question is very much about what the students who finish their study abroad come back with. Those students, in their millions, are studying abroad. They come back, some choose to stay put. When they did return from study abroad, they have made a number of landmark achievements in the modern history of China. Nowadays, there are more and more Chinese students studying abroad, and an increasing number of graduates return from overseas studies. Some critics have criticized the returned students, saying they just focus on making money rather than changing Chinese society. Do you agree? I mean, this is very controversial.
Well, China is undergoing a huge crisis morally and culturally, I think, despite of the great economic expansion, becoming the world's biggest power.
The understatement of this skepticism, the understatement of this scathing criticism about the returned students is whether they showed a due sense of being patriotic. If you come back not for money, you come here to pursue Chinese dream, to help realize the rejuvenation of a great Chinese nation. If you come here for money because there are opportunities in Chinese market, then you are not very patriotic. Is this correct?
Well, I think these students should have a sense of responsibilities. So that's why I was talking about cultural identity, cultural responsibility. You go there not to just learn the skill how to make more money, but to learn a spirit that you can help your country or maybe the world.
Don't you think that patriotism is one of the universal values? And in fact, JFK said, don't ask what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your own country. So being patriotic is not necessarily the unique virtue native of a Western country or an Oriental country. It is a universal value, don't you think so?
Yes, it is universal, but we should go far beyond patriotism. We should think about humanism. We should think
one step beyond patriotism, it could be nationalism. Well, that's
that's good. Let's go beyond. This is a cosmic world. This is a great era of internet expansion. Nationalism, patriotism is too narrow, it seems to me. We should go far beyond that. We should think about our individual relationship with the world, with nature, and with the future. So we should just really think a little bit further.
Daniel, is there anything wrong with the nationalism? Because when I was interviewing Prime Minister Karamanlis, the former Prime Minister of Greece, before the opening ceremony of the Athens Olympic Games, he said, look, Yang Rui, we should not aim to make money through Olympic Games, unlike commercialization of the same games in Los Angeles in the 1980s. What we do is to take people back to the ancient Greece and look at Beijing, very much like in the old city of Athens. You turn over one cobble, one stone in the street of Beijing, below it is the history of 5,000 years. That's civilization, a heavy sense of history. So the director of the opening ceremony of the Athens Olympic Games said to me, Ray, there's nothing wrong with the nationalism. That's something I love deeply. What do you think?
So there's good and bad forms of nationalism. The good forms, if you have special commitment to a country or maybe a civilization, pride in its history, of course that's desirable. And also if it could motivate people to do good things for other citizens, for example, if the people are proud Chinese and that's why from the rich parts of China they want to help the poor parts of China, that's great. But if the bad forms of nationalism are the ones that are founded on hatred of outsiders, and of course those are the dangerous forms that have led there's so many disasters in the 20th century.
Well, media tends to simplify the word of nationalism as if all kinds of nationalism should be called, labeled bad and evil and do more harm than good to globalization in an age of nation states. What do you think?
I like the word nationalism, come to think of it. I think we should love our country or love your country. For instance, China should love its own cultural heritage. I don't think we are doing enough. We're tearing down, demolish our cultural relics.
But ironically, we didn't
that's not
do,
enough nationalism.
Ironically, we didn't do half as good as the other side of the Taiwan Strait, despite, their dynamics in being more alienated from the mainland due to Chen Shui-bian, former leader of the DPP, the pro-secession forces, who did much to de-Sinicize, 去中国化, to get rid of the elements of Chinese culture. But still many in the mainland said, oh, they were able to preserve much of the traditional Chinese culture.
We should have a cultural renaissance.
Cultural renaissance.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a beautiful phrase.
I think we must have it. We need to renew and refresh our culture. The Chinese culture need to be integrated into the world culture.
But I'm afraid that your mention of a cultural renaissance has been held hostage, unfortunately, by local government officials. I mean, at least 10 or 15 years ago, local government officials would tend to use 文化搭台经贸唱戏. They use Chinese culture to set up the platform, in fact, in the hope of attracting overseas investment. They hold different cultural festivals.
Well, that's the first step. The next step, the very essence of China national spirit, should be to help the country to grow its identity. We're losing our China and identity. It's very risky right now. You become a superpower, many people fear you, but you should set up your cultural identity, become the world contributor. So which we don't have, Andy, right?
Right, and there's two main traditions in China, and one, or at least political traditions. And legalism is one that has had also great influence in Chinese history, and this is that the rulers need to rely on fear in order to rule a country and use of harsh punishment. But the other is Confucianism, and that's the use of what we can call, using modern language, soft power, ritual, moral example. The more that culture is revived, I think the more it could serve as an inspiration, not just for China, but for the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for being with us in discussing Chinese culture and what we can learn from a comparison between the East and the West in this year of a monkey. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.